I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of Israel being a settler colonial state, an idea which I think seems very central to the people protesting in the West on behalf of what they would see as the axis of resistance, the resistance to Western colonial imperialism. And I think the idea of Israel being a settler colonial state is one that is widely accepted in academic circles and among people working in NGOs and the voluntary and public sectors. Now, the idea stems from a book published in 1999 by Patrick Wolfe, Settler Colonialism and the Transformation of Anthropology, an extremely influential book. And Wolfe makes an excellent and valid distinction between settler colonial projects and extractive projects. So the great settler colonial projects are Canada, the United States, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, in the Algeria, and then Australia, New Zealand, and Southern Africa. And they were by bringing people to settle and remain in significant populations and transform the social, legal, ethnic, and so on framework of the countries that they colonized. These were very different from the extractive colonies, examples of which probably the worst example would be the Belgians in the Congo, but the British in West Africa, the British again in East Africa, although there were some settlers. There were some settlers there. Obviously, the British in India, the French in Vietnam. I think, though, that there is also some very pronounced and profound differences between the settlement of Israel by Jews, or the resettlement of Israel by Jews, and the settler colonial projects of the great 18th and 19th century, of the great 18th and 19th century empires. And there are two particular differences which I just like to discuss. One is the role of a metropole. So metropole is the mother country. So Britain is the metropole in the in the Anglosphere. France is the metropole with Algeria, or with French West Africa, and then Spain is the metropole for Mexico and Peru, and Portugal for Brazil. The other difference is the difference in the character, the situation, the aspirations of the settlers themselves, and they were quite distinct. Let's just start with the metropole. The metropole in the 18th and 19th century settler colonial projects is extremely important. The metropole provides transport. It provides a market for the goods that the settlers produce. It provides capital. It provides people to actually go and settle in the colonies. Above all, it supplies military power, and not just settler militias, although they exist and they can be pretty vicious, but coordinated, coherent, professional military, organized military contingents, both on land and on sea. Now, when we think of and just to give an example, when following the American Revolutionary War, which really was not a revolutionary war, it was a war of secession. I think the recent 250th anniversary is, which looking at the Declaration of Independence, has pointed out several times that there's no mention of America in the Declaration. There's several mentions of the British and the English, of being British and being English. So what happened in well, not really until 1783, until the war had gone through and so on and so forth, is then that the metropole shifts from London to Washington DC, and indeed the first act of the new Congress was the annexation of the Northwestern Territories, which nowadays comprise the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So the founding fathers, the revolutionaries, were very intent on seizing the privileges and the power and the control that went to the metropole, becoming a metropole in their own right, and in settling new territories to the west. And through the 19th century, particularly following the Civil War, that use of military power became particularly brutal. And you think of the Indian Wars from 1866 to 1890. They're drawing on veterans, predominantly of the Union Army, but I'm sure there were Confederates in there too, but veterans of the Union Army, so battle-hardened, professional soldiers under the command of none other than William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman, one of the great generals of the Civil War. Sherman, who understood in his march through the South, in his march through Georgia, that the way that you defeat a hostile force in the modern world is to destroy its civilian infrastructure. That's what he did in Georgia, and that's what he did on the western frontier among the Indian nations. It was Sherman and the Union armies in the Indian nations, in the Indian Wars, who really devised the strategy of disruption, separation, and extermination. And the Indian population fell in the United States through those years from around 325,000 to about 250,000, a catastrophic fall in the population, and it's a wonder that they survived at all, let alone that they continue to survive unto this day. So that's an example of how the metropole provides military enforcement to back up the colonial, the settler-colonial enterprise. And that was the same in Australia. The redcoats who pushed back and in many cases exterminated the Aboriginals. It was this case in New Zealand where the British Army turned up in order to fight the Maori in the land wars. Again in the 1860s, and then of course in Algeria the parachutists who were notoriously cruel and brutal in Algeria's war of independence. So you can't the Jews coming to Israel in the 1940s and 1950s. There is no metropole. There are sympathizers in the United States and Canada and Britain and in different parts of Western Europe, but there's no metropole. There is no coordination of capital, of transport, of providing a market for the goods that the settlers are going to produce, and in particular, there is no professional army or navy to back up the settlers and to deal with the indigenous population. And if you think about the War of Independence or the Nakba, and it was kind of both of those things at the same time. The Jews had been on the British side, So they tended to be in the British Army because the British were, held control of Palestine and Egypt through the war. So they were able to join the British forces. They were trained up by the British forces. So they had military experience, not necessarily particularly big battles or anything, but they had military experience. They had military training. They had sympathizers. They were able to raise money. They were also organized. Many of them were very educated people. They knew the West. They'd come from the West, so they knew how to manipulate, as it were, the sort of the corridors of power and governance in the West. Whereas the Arabs, although the Arab League was officered by the British, and so it was led by the British, and so it was actually quite effective within its limits, I guess. But the Arabs had tended to be on the side of the Germans, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and so on. So the Germans never got there, so they had very little actual military experience. I think they were probably quite naive about accumulating weapons and training and so on and so forth, and probably also quite complacent, thinking, they're only Jews. I mean, who can't beat the Jews? So although the Jews won that war, quite decisively, it wasn't about. They didn't do it by importing a professional soldiery or a professional navy from a far off metropole to whom they held allegiance. So very different from the experience of New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Canada, Mexico, and so on. And just thinking a little bit back about the population of the Palestinians, and go back to the Native Americans. The Native American population fell catastrophically. The Palestinian population in 1948 was about 1.5 million, or 1.4 million, I think, and now it's about 14 million. So it has grown tenfold since that time. And demographics are a pretty good indicator of social social success. So the situation. That's the role of the metropole. The other big difference is the condition and the status of the settlers themselves. The settlers going west in America, going to Canada, in Brazil, or certainly in Australia, New Zealand. These are people, so they're under the protection of the metropole. Their journeys are very often subsidized and made safe. When they get there, they're very often parceled out land. You have like the great land grab in Oklahoma. In New Zealand, you had, after the Second World War, you had vast tracts of the country that were parceled out to veterans, to army veterans, as in kind of gratitude to the work that they'd done through the war. And these were lands that had literally been confiscated or stolen from the native population, and the new settlers were given these parcels of land, and the professional soldiery, the professional military from the metropole, from the homeland, protected them in their new dwellings, in their new places. And they went to now those settlers may have been poor. They in most cases they were poor, the huddled masses, etc., 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 etc. But they weren't refugees. They were people who had a certain amount of choice, and they went thinking we're going to have our own land. We're not going to be tenants anymore. We're going to own something. We're going to have a bit of capital. We're going to we're going to tend the land. We're going to grow things. We're going to export it back to the metropole, and we're going to earn that hard currency, and we're going to have that money to buy things in the metropole that we want. Nice teapots and nice clothes and kind of manufactured goods. So they're there going particularly to improve their economic and social condition. And when you get to the colonies, to the settler colonies, apart from the indigenous population, there's a degree of equality. You're not tipping your cap to Sir this and Lord so and so anymore. There's no lords and there's no sirs and everybody. There's a much greater degree of social and economic equality. And those states now, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are very proud, particularly now, of their of those traditions of social egalitarianism. Now, that is just completely different to the Jewish situation in the 1940s and 1950s. They're in displaced persons camps and DP camps scattered around continental Europe. You can say, why didn't they go? Well, there weren't many Germans because there were never many German Jews, because there were never many Jews in Germany in the first place. Most of the French Jews had been decimated. So most of the Jews are going to, if they're going to go anywhere, they're going to go back to Eastern Europe. When they tried to go back to Eastern Europe, there were pogroms. They were met with violence. They were met with extreme hostility from people who had been bred over generations to despise the Jews. They tended to be very poor. They're not like Western European Jews where they're lawyers and business people and traders and so on. The Eastern European Jews are at best they're artisans. A lot of them are tavern keepers and tinkers and tailors and all that kind of thing. So they're quite poor people. They haven't got a lot to go back to. Even if it was available to them, when they did get back, their homes had been taken over by Gentiles, who didn't want to, give up their new homes and who chased them off quite frankly, and chased them off often quite violently. So there wasn't a lot of choice about where they could go. They weren't being allowed into the United States. They weren't being allowed into Britain. The West European states weren't looking for them. They couldn't go to the Arab countries. Quite a few went to Argentina. Quite a few went to Southern Africa. Quite a few went to very few went to New Zealand. But there weren't a lot of choices. And then, although there are sympathisers and the like who are kind of helping with, and often quite powerful people and quite rich people who are trying to help, there was no kind of organised, subsidised, coherent structure for bringing them to the new country, and once they were there, to protecting them and parceling out the land and moving out the indigenous people and so on and so forth. It was much more chaotic than that, and much more desperate than that, and desperate for the Jews as much as it was desperate for the Palestinians. So in many ways, the Jews were much more similar to the migrants who have come particularly from southern and central Asia and to some extent from Western Asia into Western Europe since the 1950s and more so since the 1960s. So they're and particularly in more recent times when they're coming from war-torn countries and escaping threats of violence and the likelihood of torture and death and so on and so forth. It's much more akin to that demographic than to the 19th century settler-colonial demographic. There was nowhere to go back. Now another argument I think that comes about it is that okay, they're a settler colonial population, which, as I say, I don't agree with. I don't think that bears any factual examination. But they just came late, so they just in the 1940s and 50s or 60s, just at a time when that settler colonial age was finished and you couldn't be doing it anymore. You had to, you had rich white people, had to stay put and stay where they are and make the best of the countries that they're born in. There's no recolonize. There's no more colonial projects. But actually, 5 million people left the United Kingdom never mind other parts of Western Europe, but 5 million people left the United Kingdom between 1945 and 1965 to go and settle, particularly in the Dominions in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Southern Africa. Auckland, Cape Town, Sydney, Melbourne, Toronto, Vancouver, particularly, those cities were created through that post-war migration. They existed before. They existed in like seedbeds prior to those years. But that was a big migration at exactly the same time that Israel was being populated by Jews, not just from Europe, but also Jews who were being driven out of the Arab countries, particularly out of Iraq and out of Egypt, Algeria, which had big Jewish, Lebanon, which had big Jewish populations, and Iran, who were exposed to really awful pogroms and violence in order to bear the frustration, I suppose, of the Arab countries for whom the kind of Nazi sympathies hadn't worked out the way that they might have hoped. I'll just say two more things. One is that I understand entirely that a lot of all of this is sort of feels kind of academic when you're thinking that we're in the midst of a war in the Middle East that has been pursued by Israel in an unconsignable manner with the most dreadful brutality, and just with a cost of life that is evidently been wasted because they haven't achieved any of their war aims. They've killed tens of thousands of innocent people, women, children, and that's not counting the people that have been maimed and who have lost their families and orphaned and widowed and so on and so forth. To achieve what? Hamas is still there, Iran is still there, Hezbollah is still there. There's been no positive outcome for whatever, and that casts such a deep and dark shadow over any kind of theoretical view of what the situation might be. But nevertheless, I think it is important when people are out chanting this, that, and the next thing, that the settler-colonial parallel is false and it's not right. And what we should be thinking about is that these populations are there; they're all there. Whether their historic legitimacy of 80 or 100 years ago is no more relevant in the Middle East than it's relevant in Ontario or California or New South Wales or New Zealand. Those people are there, and then the Middle East does not lack resource. It does not lack educated populations. It does not lack capital. It does not lack sympathy. It does not lack beauty and potential. And really, it's that future that could provide so much for themselves and for the world. Should peace should they be blessed with peace? That is what's important, and the only thing that's holding that up is ideology, and some of these very bitter and nasty and hateful ideologies, which I think with. And there are fringes on both. There are on both sides. This is some of the messianic settler communities, obviously Hamas and Hezbollah. I think the IRGC in Iran, who I think are just have very, very ugly ideas about what they want to do to their neighbours. None of that is helping anybody, and there is no, and what could be achieved through peace to populations who are there and who have got nowhere else to go is immeasurable, and that really is what we should be focusing on. And to get to that, it is important to unravel some of these set ideas that people have about legitimacy and justice and so on.